So feminism was the idea for many of these women of empowering white women above savages. So let's start off with the suffragettes' view of black men in the 19th century. Now, in the 19th century, the dominant form of understanding race was in a discipline called ethnology. Ethnology was a field of science that utilized comparisons between the men of different races to talk about racial evolution. In the 19th century, the status of the men were supposed to indicate the overall position on the hierarchy of development of the race in general. This is an idea that held well to the mid-20th century. Now, for many people, we don't really think of feminism as being an outgrowth of any particular issue besides women's rights. Historically, that's incorrect. If you look at Stephanie E. Jones Rogers' recent book, They Were Her Property, she argues that white women's owning of black people as slaves, that's 40% of white women, or 40% of the slaves owned were actually owned by white women in the United States, was part of the basis of white women's political power, political movements, and their notions of equality. So that means that when we're trying to contextualize what were the antecedents to how white women conceptualized their rights, liberation, and freedom, part of that was in the owning of black people. Now, this really does situate what contemporary literature thinks of as feminism's origins are the struggle for white women's rights, because part of the argument of white-female equality wasn't just to be equal with men. Rather, it was about making sure that the white race had a position that was elevated over all other races. Now, we see this in Louise Michelle Newman's work, White Women's Rights, The Racial Origins of Feminism in the United States, as well as the work of Allison Snyder and Suffragettes of an Imperial Age. The idea that white people should rule over other groups of people was a central concept driving the right to the ballot. Now, for many people in the West, we think that the right to vote is merely an expression of democracy. That wasn't the case in the 19th century. Debates over intelligence, debates over civilization, debates over language and religion were all arguments for how people should or should not have the capacity to rule over others. And white women made sure they were at the very front of the line in that debate. So that means that suffrage was a movement that was ultimately debating how different groups of people should rule together. And this was the argument that Elizabeth Cady Stanton made in 1868 as to why white women, specifically educated white women, should rule alongside educated white men. I don't have time to read the whole thing, but the important part is to realize that where she conceptualized the brutal nature of men as hard, selfish, conquering, and destroying, and the nature of women as love, she thought that these two things find balance in the natural world, that just like nature, men and women complement each other, so that the love of the woman can stave off kind of the genocidal impulses of the man. And this is why she ultimately said that, look, if the civilization of the age calls for an extension of the suffrage, surely a government of the most virtuous, educated men and women would better represent the whole and protect the interests of all than the representation of either sex alone. So while we have this notion, right, and I know what we read in the university that, the right to vote was about equality for men and women. Yeah, but there were scientific and ethnological presumptions about the roles that white men and white women played in bringing along civilization to make sure that white supremacy stayed at the top. So part of this issue then, right, the reason that many of these suffragettes like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had such trouble with black men getting the right to vote wasn't that black men were being placed first. It was that these savage men would endanger the white race. And take a little bit of time to actually read this quote because I think it's incredibly impactful, right? She's like, so long as there's a disenfranchised class and that class of women of the nation, a man's government, so all men voting, is worse than a white man's government. Because in proportion as you multiply the tyrants, you make the condition of the subjects more hopeless and degraded. Just so if woman finds it hard to bear the oppressive laws of a few Saxon fathers, the best orders of manhood, you see the racial tone there, right? What may she not be called to endure when all the lower orders, natives and foreigners, Dutch, Irish, Chinese, and Africans legislate for her and her daughters? Think of Patrick and Sambo. Hans and Young Tung, who do not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who never read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for Lydia Marie Childs, Lucretia Mott, and Fetty Kimball. Think of jurors drawn from the ranks to try young girls for the crime of infanticide. And this quote is very important because infanticide is basically what we think of with abortion. This is what they called abortion in the 19th century. So the idea was that women had a right to righteously propagate, that you wanted to keep a strong race. So white women didn't kill babies like the mothers of the savage races who didn't understand the importance of strong progeny. So she's worried here that if racialized men, black men, Chinese men, etc., have the right to vote, that they'll make laws that will ultimately doom the race. So Phoebe Cousins, for instance, in 1887, makes a very similar argument, but she isolates it to black men. She says, look, I've seen, black men and women. I've studied them. I've been around them. Right? Black women are more oppressed. And it's interesting here how she uses this argument, right? Because as a class, right, black women are more intelligent than black men, but they're subject to greater brutalities, while compelled to perform the exact same labor as men toiling by their side in the field. So that's a very important statement because it's suggesting that there was no division of labor, no sex roles between black men and women. Remember, you have to think like a 19th century theorist or ethnologist during this period of time. Sex difference was the basis of racial evolution. If you had a race that was actually egalitarian, that means that the race didn't evolve sex roles. It didn't evolve what we call genders. So men and women did the same thing. That was the definition of savagery during this period of time. A civilized race understood the difference between men and women. Men have a role, women have a role. So that's why the white race was the basis of how the home developed and why we have this concept of the nuclear family. So for her to make the claim that these women do the exact same work as men suggests the brutalities imposed on women, because a woman should not do the same work as a man during this period of time. So black men as a class are very tyrannical in their families, according to Phoebe Cousins. They've learned the lesson of the brute force too well, and as the marriage law allows the husband to entire control over his wife's earnings and her children, she's in worse bondage than before. So she's in worse bondage marrying a black man than slavery. Think about that, right? In many cases, the task of providing for helpless children and an idle, lazy husband is imposed on the patient wife and mother. And with this sudden elevation of citizenship, which the mass of stupid, ignorant Negroes look upon as entitling them to great honor, I regard the future state of the Negro woman without the ballot in her hand as deplorable. Now, these sorts of statements can be found throughout the history of suffrage debate. In fact, I got that from the History of Suffrage, Volume 2, right? These arguments are not just about the personal prejudices that white suffragettes or white feminists had. They're a reflection of the scientific consensus of the time. The idea that lower evolved people, savage people, did not have the ability to rule over others. And this is part of the issue with why we think of political rights as always expanding in the West, has this dark side. This idea that certain groups of people actually do become politically empowered, they endanger civilization or the civilization in the country and the nation as a whole. This is well reflected in Rebecca Latimer Felton's brief piece. She believed that allowing black men to have the right to vote actually made them rapists. Because they were degraded forms of men, the very idea of them being able to vote and believing in the mistake that they were like white men meant that they would ravish white women. The effect of this, of course, as a good feminist of her day, was of course to be against rape. And the way that she thought that we should do that is, if it requires lynching to protect women's dearest possession from ravening, drunken human beast, I say lynch 8,000 Negroes a week if necessary. So the idea, again, going from the racial tenor of the times, and I didn't pick random suffragettes or feminists, these are leading feminist thinkers, right? The idea of the time is that the white nation has a responsibility to propagate itself. So empowering other people politically within the borders that are not white women destroys the ability of the race to both reproduce and creates a threat from within. So feminism was the idea for many of these women of empowering white women above savages. And we're going to see that reflected in a little bit when we start talking about the evolutionary origins of patriarchy. So white women saw themselves as playing a major role in contributing to the persistence and perseverance of white supremacy. They believed, in fact, that they created the white patriarch, and that it was only through patriarchy that the future of the race could be protected. So the evolutionary origins of patriarchy, contrary to being this male dominance that we all think of, was actually feminine. I introduce you to Charlotte Gilman, who is an evolutionary theorist and, of course, a racist. Gilman's work justified the extermination, re-enslavement, and ruling of the lesser races, while claiming that the origin of white patriarchy and the capacity of global white supremacy was actually authored by the white woman. Now, Gilman was a premier theorist that was actually doing reviews and panels in London well into the 1930s. Despite this fact of her being a leading figure in early 20th century feminism, her work is actually pretty obscure. You rarely hear about her. But people like Jane Addams and feminists all around the world, even reviews of her work in the New York Times, said that she was the premier feminist of both the 19th and 20th century. Her work influenced the very idea that evolution had a part to play in the development not only of women's roles, but women as a catalyst to preserve the power of the white race. Now, according to Gilman, female subjugation was actually necessary for racial evolution. Contrary to, the yellow wallpaper that she's well known for, she actually argues that the home was a place that allowed white women to teach white men how to care for people of the other race. Now, what she does think is oppressive is the fact that the home is now a relic of an evolutionary past. That now that women have evolved white men to care for other white people, because initially white men were individualistic, white women have developed and evolved beyond the home. And that's part of their oppression. That they're kept in the home and not allowed to rule over other races like white men have that they've taught, right? But the home doesn't become an oppressive institution in and of itself. As you can see from the quote, she actually believes that the subjugation of women has led to an enormous degree of the maternalization of men. Now, the reason that this is important is because in caring for other groups of people within the home, namely the white woman and the white child, the white man took on maternal characteristics. Now, according to Gilman, racial characteristics, the ability of people to recognize races and their own kind, was a maternal quality that was given to women by God. So the reason that a white woman knows that she cares for a child because the child is like her and of her is because God made her a mother. This maternal quality was the basis of white supremacy. Because feminists during this period of time theorized men as individualistic, brutish, and genocidal, the idea was that they had to change that because one white male individual would kill another white male individual simply on the basis of power and conquest. So we get this. This is traditional second wave feminist theory, right? But the piece that they leave out is, well, the white woman then had to teach these two white men to care for each other. They had to create a kind of sentiment that would allow them to think beyond their individuality to their race content. And this is the role that the home played. So rather than men working purely on their male instincts to destroy one another and be individualistic, the home allowed the man to care for the white woman and the white child. It taught him how to love people that shared a kinship relationship with him. And this is what allowed him to become a man-mother, or what would we now call a white supremacist or patriarch. The reason that we would say that is because in the man becoming a man-mother, he cared for people of his own racial kind. And he's a patriarch because it's through his male leadership that the world is then made safe for the white woman to exit the home and come into the world and rule next to him as an equal partner. Now, that's early 20th century ethnology. The political effect of this was that it created a certain kind of proxemic. What I mean by that is that white women created the boundaries between themselves and others. Now, in the United States, we can see that through the growth of female KKK organizations that marched the streets of places like Waco, Texas in the early 1900s. The idea of white women's rights simply being for freedom is grossly exaggerated, because you have to understand that the debates that preceded and the debates during this period of time were about the responsibilities that white women had to protect white supremacy at all costs. This meant that white women's rights became framed as a nationalistic extension of white supremacy, of the ability of white people to rule and project themselves upon other groups of people without apology. This is the foundation of nations like the United States, the UK, Australia, etc. Now, while we have something like settler colonialism in many of these other countries, people like Margaret Jacobs have written a fantastic text on this. What we have not done is understood how then the notions that we have of equality and freedom really have a dark side that entail the degrading and the subjugation of other groups of people to the political force of white women.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.